Hi, everyone. I think we're ready to start this web conversation today. This is Marcy Darnofsky. I'm the Executive Director here at the Center for Genetics and Society. And before we start, I just want to let you know that if you're having any technical problems at all, you can call Charles Garzone and he can help you out. The most common problem, however, is that you have too many other programs open on your computer. So if you're experiencing slow video or video and audio that's not synced up, try closing down some of the programs that you have open first. Okay, we have people continuing to join us, but let's get started. We are very glad today to have another in our series of Talking Biopolitics web conversations with wonderful cutting-edge thinkers and authors who are thinking about the social implications of human biotechnologies. And today we have with us from London, Donna Dickenson, the author of Me Medicine versus We Medicine, Reclaiming Biotechnology for the Common Good. She'll be interviewed today by Osagie Obasagi, and then we'll bring your questions into the conversation during the latter half of the program. So we invite you at any time during this hour to type your questions into the Q&A box or pod that you'll see at the bottom right of the screen. And then we'll be taking those questions about halfway through the program. Okay, let's see. We wanted to let you know that you can view and listen to previous Talking Biopolitics conversations on the CGS YouTube channel. And we've had some wonderful conversations. This year, most recently, we talked with Ruha Benjamin, the author of People's Science, Bodies and Rights on the Stem Cell Frontier, her new book. We also talked earlier this year with George Estreich about his memoir, The Shape of the Eye, which is about raising his daughter, Laura, who has Down syndrome, and his experiences thinking about disabilities and early fetal gene tests that are rapidly being introduced. And then also this year, we spoke with Miriam Zoll, who's written a book, Cracked Open, about the fertility industry, her own experiences in the fertility industry. And this book is continuing to get a lot of attention, actually. We also have several interviews that we did last year in 2012 online that are all really interesting. One with Bill McKibben, the author of Enough, Staying Human in an Engineered Age, about biotechnology, human biotechnologies, and how his concerns about those technologies connect to his work on climate change. We talked with Dorothy Roberts about Fatal Invention, her book about how science, politics, and big business recreate race in the 21st century. That's the subtitle of her book. And also last year we spoke with Harriet Washington about Deadly Monopolies, which looks at the medical industrial complex and the many ways that commercial dynamics have aggravated issues of distributive justice and social justice. So those are all online. The links that you see on the slides that we're putting up are all live links if you want to bookmark them during this program. But in addition, we'll be sending you an email afterwards with all these links to the different resources that we're mentioning. We're in the process of arranging a fall series of Talking Biopolitics events, and we'll be letting you know about that lineup soon. And the idea, just to back up with some context, the idea of this Talking Biopolitics series is that we want to sponsor these conversations because we see all these books and all these thinkers, the work of these thinkers, as part of the efforts to really instigate thinking about, talking about, and action about human biotech issues, to build a new biopolitics that's grounded in social justice and public interest values. So we thank you for joining us today and for being part of those efforts. And we want to ask you, and we'll be asking you again later, to consider contributing to the work of the Center for Genetics and Society with a donation of $25 or more, which we will put to good use toward the Talking Biopolitics series and our other efforts. Okay, a few words about the logistics of today's events. First, we'll have the conversation between Osagie and Donna. Osagie has some questions for Donna, and we'll take 25-30 minutes for that. Following that, we'll break for just a couple minutes with some more resource information for you, and then go back and take up the conversation again, bringing your own questions into it. So again, please type your questions at any point during the program into the Q&A box that you see at the bottom right of your screen there. We just want to let you know, it's probably clear, obvious by now, we've muted the lines of all the participants in order to just make it sure that we have adequate, good audio quality for everybody. And again, I want to remind you that if you experience any slowdowns, please try closing down your computer, your other computer applications. But if you can't resolve it on your own, you can give Charles Garzone a call at 510-665-7760, extension 301. And I want to let you know that we are recording this video, so it too will be available on the CGS website, along with all the other Talking Biopolitics conversations. Okay, just a few words about the Center for Genetics and Society. Our mission is to work for responsible uses and effective societal governance of human genetic and reproductive technologies. And we have found it important to articulate the values in which we ground the new biopolitics that we're working toward. And you see them there. We ground our work in social justice, human rights, ecological integrity, the common good, and democratic governance. We do this work in three categories of ways. First, we focus quite a lot of our work on media and communications, and we are able to say that we are regularly quoted in top-tier media. We publish in outlets ranging from academic journals to daily newspapers. And as many of you know, we are often in your inbox, and we have a full suite of online social media kinds of resources. The second leg of our three-legged stool is network building. CGS is, we think, the key public interest organization working to build an international network of advocates, scholars, policymakers, artists, and others to address and help build the new biopolitics. And the third leg of our stool is public policy interventions. We've been active at the state level, national, and international levels on selected policy interventions. So that's what we do. We hope you'll take advantage of the many resources that CGS has to offer, and that you'll keep in touch with us about your own work and your own thoughts on these important topics. And also that you'll support us with your contributions. Okay, now we're ready to introduce our presenters today, Donna Dickenson and Osagie Obasagi. And Donna and Osagie, would you please start sharing your video so that we bring you into this conversation visually as well? Thanks, great. Okay, I'll first introduce Donna. Donna is here with us from London. She's Emeritus Professor of Medical Ethics and Humanities at the University of London. She's Research Associate at the University of Oxford and also Visiting Fellow at the University of Bristol, all in the UK. But she was born and educated in New England, and she began her career as a journalist in New York, worked on a criminal court reform project in that city, and then became an associate in research at Yale University. And since then, she's published more than 20 books and 60 refereed articles in the fields of medical ethics and medical law. In 2006, she became the first woman to win the International Spinoza Lens Award for contribution to public debate on ethics. And this book and previous books are quite worth your time. And Donna, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me.
Now let me introduce Osagie Obasagi. Osagie is professor of law at the University of California Hastings College of Law. That's here in San Francisco in the Bay Area. And he has a joint appointment at the University of California, San Francisco, UCSF, in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences. And I'm very, very pleased to say that he's also a senior fellow here at the Center for Genetics and Society. And in fact, before that, he was the director of CGS's Project on Bioethics, Law, and Society. Osagie, too, is a prolific and wonderful writer. His writings span academic and public outlets. And his first book, Blinded by Sight, is due out later this year from Stanford University Press.
Okay. Well, thank you, Marcy. So, Donna, I think to start off would be good to start with, what exactly is personalized medicine? So what counts as personalized medicine?
Yeah, I think we should start with that because people use the term very freely, but they may not all use it in the same sense. The way in which it's most frequently used is to refer to things like spit kits, that is, the number of firms on the market that will allow you to take a sample of your DNA, either through spit or sometimes a cheek swab, send it in and have it analyzed for a number of genetic markers, and they vary according to which markers they do, which means that the results also vary, and we'll come on to that maybe later about the reliability of the tests. So that's a frequent use of the term. Another frequent use of the term is in terms of pharmacogenetics, which means tailoring drugs to either to your individual genome, or in the case of oncology, of cancer medicine, to the genome of the tumor. And the advantage in that is meant to be that you can avoid the sort of sometimes scorched earth kind of chemotherapy that was very common in the past. For people who don't need as heavy a dose as other people, then maybe you can spare them some of the side effects. So that's the rationale behind that. Those are probably the two most frequent uses of the term. But in my book, I include a number of other uses, which I don't think other people have included, but which I think are similar. One is private umbilical cord blood banking, whereby a portion of the blood that would normally flow from the mother to the infant during the final stage of delivery, that is, the delivery of the placenta after the delivery of the baby, instead of being allowed to flow, it's a portion, about 30%, is taken and banked privately. Now, why is that personalized? Well, the idea is that this blood is personalized in a sort of possible spare parts kit for the baby because it is genetically unique to that child, except maybe with twins. That's one phenomenon. And another one that I look at is the idea of being the best me I can possibly be through enhancement. That's the slogan that often, enhancement technology advocates use. And the idea there is that you would have either neurocognitive types of enhancements, drug types of enhancements, and also there is a lot of interest in the enhancement literature in producing the best children we possibly can, as they see it. I don't entirely agree with that, as we'll probably come on to. So the idea, again, of it's the best me or the best me in the next generation that I can possibly produce. And I think these all have a sort of common link in being personalized in the sense that they are about producing the best me I can possibly be, or tailored to a particular individual's genome or a particular individual's personality.
Okay. So you have a very interesting title for your book, We Medicine versus Me Medicine, and you started to explain what you mean by that in the previous answer, but I want to give you an opportunity to really talk about what you're trying to convey by that title.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Well, I've already hinted at that. I think all of these personalized technologies share an interest in me. And that's not necessarily egocentric or narcissistic. For example, with pharmacogenomics, the idea is if I'm, undergoing cancer therapy, something of that kind, what is the most tailored and effective, personalized or stratified, it's sometimes called, technique for me, because actually it's likely to be stratified by patient groups and not just by individuals. But we might come on to that later. Now, I think all of these techniques, particularly with retail genetics, that is the sort of spit samples that you can send over the internet and receive a partial genetic profile. In that case, the me bit is quite obvious because a lot of the firms that are involved actually have me in the title, in the brand. Mm-hmm. So we have 23andMe, we have Know Me, we have Decode Me. So, I think they're consciously trying to appeal to me. Now, that's one side of it. But when we think about what has really produced the greatest change for the good in our lifespans over the last 150 years, it's not individual and personalized treatments. It's been communal measures, we medicine. So it's been things like sanitation, vaccination, screening, for example, for tuberculosis, that made a big difference. Other public health kinds of programs. And I think that is also very interesting from a sort of social history of medicine viewpoint, because medicine has also, what has changed in medicine over that period has been the way in which contagious disease, which affected us all and to which we were all vulnerable, rich and poor, were alike vulnerable, say, to the cholera epidemics in London in the 1830s, or the smallpox epidemics in many countries, including the US, in the 19th century. Everyone was equally vulnerable, so the solutions had to be communal. And they were very successful solutions, so that the average male lifespan, for example, in England, went up from 45 at the turn of between the 19th and the 20th century to something like 75 at the end of the next century. Now, the question I therefore want to ask is, are the we medicine techniques the ones to which we really owe a debt? And if so, then why is it that we have what I see as a lot of threats to those types of medicine? So, for example, we have the effects of austerity programs, and of course it's generic across the Western countries, whereby public health measures are being cut back. The Centres for Disease Control in this country are having major cutbacks. In the UK, there's major cutbacks and sort of disentangling of the public health service from the National Health Service, handing it over to local councils, which means there's going to be pressure on money there. So on the contrary, by contrast, the personalized techniques are getting quite big increases in funding and a lot of commercial interest. So I think what I want to ask is, excuse me, which way do we want to go? I think we're going to have to make a choice. It'd be nice if we could do both. But in straitened economic times, maybe we can't have both. And then I think we really, before we just jump on the me medicine bandwagon, and I'm not, saying it's a bad thing necessarily. I'm trying to give it a reality check and see what it can promise, what it can genuinely do, and look at the evidence. But I think we also need to make some decisions. And by polarizing the two types into me and we, I sort of try to direct us down that track of saying, let's make a decision.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So the book is framed around identifying 4 possible factors for the rise of me medicine that you've identified. And so you talk about threat, narcissism, corporate interests, and the dominance of choice or autonomy. So can you discuss each of these factors and how they each might contribute to this normalizing of me medicine?
Yeah, sure. What I try to do in the book, first of all, is to look at the evidence base. So there has been a lot of hype, and I think we'll come on to that later, about some aspects of personalized medicine. And there has been a claim from, quite high up people, quite influential people, including Obama, saying that personalized medicine is the most exciting development in medicine in this century. Well, what I want to ask, first of all, is that true? And by going through the evidence, I find that in some areas, like in pharmacogenomics, particularly in cancer treatments, yeah, there are some really strong and hopeful, genuine developments there. In other areas, in private versus public umbilical cord blood banking, there was a Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists report in the UK. There have been two of them actually showing that, or saying that actually this was harmful to the baby, not beneficial. So in some cases, the evidence is not there. In some cases, the evidence is adverse. And in some cases, the evidence is favorable. And what I try to do, first of all, is to say, what is the evidence? Let's give it a reality check. And I do find that the evidence alone is not enough to explain this huge rise of interest. The scientific evidence isn't enough. So then I suggest, well, what else might explain it? And I bring together 4 ideas that I think are pretty much my own ideas, but, you know, individually, I think they've been treated elsewhere, but bringing them together, I think is kind of unique to possibly explain it. The first one is the idea that we're worried about public medicine. And the statistic that I think is really interesting is that a Eurobarometer poll of European countries showed that less than half of all respondents would accept blood that wasn't either their own blood banked in advance or a transfusion from a family member. That means half of European, respondents wouldn't accept blood from a stranger. They sense that as a threat and not as something beneficial. How has that changed? Because back in the time when Richard Titmuss wrote The Gift Relationship, the US was the one that was supposed to distrust, the communal system of blood banking. And the European countries, particularly the UK, was thought to be a model for public banking, communal banking. So it seems as if something really has changed, and there is a sense that public medicine is a threat rather than beneficial. And there's other ways in which I look at the notion of threat too, but that's just one example. I already mentioned the idea that the private genetic testing companies, the retail genetics testing companies, use me in the brand. So some people have said, well, that's kind of narcissistic, isn't it? And there have been studies that claim to show there is a general and society-wide rise in narcissism. So is it narcissism that explains it? Is it self-absorption? I actually find this is the least effective explanation. And in some cases, I think it's actually positively offensive. I think, saying that a cancer patient who uses pharmacogenetic medicines is being narcissistic is just offensive, But I do try to use that, and I think maybe in the case of the enhancement drugs, it works better than in, say, pharmacogenetics. I also look at the importance of autonomy and choice in our cultures, most Western cultures, and in particular in the way in which me medicine is presented as a responsible thing for a patient to do, so get yourself genetically tested, know in advance of having any conditions such as cancer what your genetic profile is, and have a choice about whether to use those techniques. And I think because the term personal and choice, those two terms, they do push the right buttons in most of our psyches. So I think that explanation goes a certain way. But the one that I find really most interesting, and I think works best across the board, is the one about new corporate strategies and backed up by neoliberal government policies. And I think, for example, in terms of drug companies facing the expiry of patents on big blockbuster drugs, which many are, that is facing the expiry of patents on drugs like Viagra or Prozac, ones that were one size fits all, that were for everybody. Instead, they are looking at the niche markets that are afforded by the pharmacogenetic drugs. And most of these drugs, even the ones that are effective, do come in with very, very high price tags. So I've actually looked at some of the sources like Bloomberg Business News and the Personalized Medicine Coalition's newsletter. And they actually say, yeah, this is our strategy. We are trying to find a new market, which is going to be a niche market where, like a niche market for a handbag or something, you charge, a designer fee. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily a conspiracy, because they are facing smaller numbers who want the drugs and for whom the drugs are going to work. They can't produce blockbusters. They have to go for the niche marketing price. It is necessarily going to be higher. And then we have to decide whether that's what we want our insurers and our public health systems to be covering. So again, we face some choices there.
Mm-hmm. So it seems like, and you mentioned this in your previous answer, but it seems like you have a particular concern over the issue or with regards to the issue of hype, or the persistent overstating of what these technologies can do. I want you to talk about that problem and trend.
Okay. Yeah. I think, the term hype is a little, maybe a little propagandistic, but I think it's useful because we are facing a sort of onslaught of a barrage of claims that we have a paradigm shift, that we have a really major shift in what medicine is going to be like in this century. And I think, again, I try to give a sort of evidence check, a reality check here. But I think it's also really interesting to ask why people want to think that these techniques are going to work. And again, I don't prejudge. I don't come in and say, no, they're definitely all, no good. But there are a lot of books out there that do say they're definitely all wonderful. So I think I'm sort of at the moment, one of the lone voices saying, well, let's be a little more careful. Let's see if the evidence really is there. Do I have to change? And a lot of the books in favor say you must be ready to embrace this paradigm shift. And I just want to know if that's really true. Now, I think that because they share the glamour of the new biotechnologies, people, that is, the techniques share the glamour of being new biotechnologies. People do feel excited about them, and that's great. But we also know that for most people, unless, say, you have a family background of predisposition to a particular type of cancer, as in the Angelina Jolie example, then it's been advised for a long time to go and have yourself tested for the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes, which the Supreme Court decision just freed up, to be back in the public sector, not patented. So that taking of a family history is still kind of the gold standard, although it's also a pretty old-fashioned way of going about your medicine. But you could also say it's a we-centered way of going about your medicine. You find out what the rest of your family has experienced, and that's inherently communal. But in other cases, the new technologies, particularly, I think, enhancement, is very prone to this. I was at a conference on enhancement technologies in Oxford back at the beginning of last year, and they were all going on about, these technologies are here already. We just have to make a choice about whether we want to use them. And in particular, they were talking about moral enhancement. That is, whether the use of oxytocin, which is a drug that's normally used in childbirth to separate the placenta from the womb, can also make you nicer and can, create what they call moral enhancement. And I went back and did a check on the Cochrane evidence base, which is the gold standard. There's absolutely no studies showing the use of oxytocin for this purpose. There's 70 studies that are all about oxytocin in childbirth. And yet when someone at the meeting in Oxford said, well, what's the evidence? The presenter just said, oh, yeah, it's definitely happening. It's real. Well, why do we want to believe that? So I think there is a terrific tendency to believe the hype and maybe just, step back from that and say, let's look at the evidence, because after all, we're supposed to be living in a time of evidence-based medicine, which I think is correct. That's what we should.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what's the relationship between the shift from we medicine to me medicine and the rise of neoliberalism? So is there an underlying political economy that's reshaping the way we think about health and healthcare?
Yeah, I do actually make that argument. And in a way, it flows on from the idea of the importance of choice and autonomy. That is the way in which the me medicine techniques all use the word choice. And they're not alone in that. Other techniques do too. For example, when Merck was promoting its vaccine for girls from ages 12 to 15, to protect them against cervical cancer, it used the slogan, "I choose." And that's a form of medicine, that's a vaccine. But I think the importance of neoliberalism is really pretty crucial across all of the case studies. And I begin by defining what neoliberalism is and how it might be relevant. And I think it's important because we know that from about the 1980s, when we had the Bayh-Dole Act in the US and when we had Thatcherism in the UK, that the government has viewed it as its responsibility to ease the path of new technologies through helping to promote public subsidies and helping to promote venture capital, and also providing a very permissive patent strategy, which the recent Supreme Court decision has somewhat, questioned. Now, it does that obviously because it does view these as genuine money makers and as good, ways of helping science. But I think in many of the knee medicine technologies that we're looking at, I've already suggested that the science is not that strong in some cases. Now, in pharmacogenetics, it is in some types of pharmacogenetics. But we also know, it's been said by a very prominent oncologist, that the drugs that we have so far, the pharmacogenetic drugs for cancer, only work on, quote, the stupid cancers. That is, the ones that have 1 or 2 genes altered. And there was a really quite discouraging study published in the New England Journal of Medicine of tumor samples taken from 10 different sites on kidney cancers, which revealed that they all had a different genome. And that would mean that they could not have the same pharmacogenetic drug. You'd have to have at least 10. And maybe the tumor would continue to evolve. Now, let's just go back to how that relates. So I think what that means is that the government subsidy and the importance of these new techniques may or may not benefit the public as a whole, because we know that many of the techniques are not as far advanced as their proponents claim they are. And we know that the science, while it works and is very effective in some cases, is not going anywhere in others, or at least is going to be a whole lot more complicated than the proponents say it is. And therefore, you have to ask yourself, well, is the government backing, because the government has looked at the evidence and has decided this is what the population as a whole is going to benefit from? Or is the population as a whole maybe not the main issue, and the main issue is corporate lobbying? And I think if you look at, I've got most of my information from the websites and the newsletters of the Personalized Medicine Coalition and other bodies, not just that one, working in this area. And from the way in which PCAST, for example, the President's Council of Scientific Advisors, has a responsibility to include private industry in its planning of government allocation of monies. So I think in each of these cases, I've always, from the very beginning, said it's not just the science. The science is important. We need to look at the science, but we also need to look at the political and the economic background. And that background includes government policy and includes corporate attempts to influence government policy, which is, it's not surprising, of course. We shouldn't be surprised at that. But we should also be realistic about it. And we should identify cases in which maybe that lobbying is definitely in the public interest, and other cases where maybe it's not so much in the public interest.
Okay, so at this time, we're going to take a short break, and I'm going to turn things back over to Marcy Darnofsky.
Okay, thank you, Donna and Osagie. We're just going to take a couple minutes of break here before we resume and bring your questions into the conversation. And please submit your questions for Osagie to see in the Q&A pod that you see at the bottom of your screen. So I want to give you a chance to do that, and also want to let you know about some of the resources that we want to call to your attention, more information about the kinds of questions that Donna and Osagie have been discussing, and that we'll also be sending you in an email following up after this program here. So what you see there on the screen are links to Donna's website and to the page on her website about her book. And there's also information on her website about her other books, Body Shopping. She's written a recent book on bioethics. A lot of information on her website. And the links at the bottom of the screen there are to the Center for Genetics and Society website. And we compile news and commentary on different topics, including the topic of personal genomics. So that's the link that you see, the last one you see on that screen. Okay. So again, here are some more things that I'm going to just run down, but I want to let you know again that we'll be sending these all out to you in an email afterwards. And also, at the end of this program, after the Q&A portion of it, we'll be directing your screen to a very short survey so that you can give us feedback both on the any technical issues that came up for you and also the substance of this particular Talking Biopolitics conversation and ideas that you might have for future ones. So we really welcome your feedback on that very short survey. So here we show you some ways that you can stay involved with the Center for Genetics and Society. The one at the top is asking you for a contribution. And here's some of the resources that we have. We have a very extensive website and a blog that has new posts every week. If you aren't signed up for our newsletter, Biopolitical Views and News, we invite you to sign up for that. It comes out every other Thursday and compiles the 2 weeks worth of CGS commentaries and news articles from a wider range of other sources. We also have an active Twitter feed and Facebook and Google Plus pages. So we hope that you'll follow some of these links, explore them, and stay in touch with us in any of these ways. Okay, so we now want to bring some of the questions in that are coming in now, actually pretty quickly from participants. So please get your questions in, and Osagie will be relaying these to Donna, and we'll be going until the top of the hour.
Okay, thanks, Marcy. So the first question we have is it asks, Donna, could you share your thoughts on the current proposals in the United Kingdom to allow mitochondrial DNA transfer, especially regarding the politics and the framing?
Okay, yeah, I wrote a column on this for Project Syndicate, which maybe some people will have seen, but I was quite dismayed by this, but I wasn't surprised because the direction of policy in the UK recently, and particularly the consultations, so-called, by the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority, have been pretty much in the direction of allowing new technologies on request. And in some cases, that's actually been, even if the public consultations showed that the public actually wasn't too happy about that. The reason I have concerns about the mitochondrial DNA technique, and I co-wrote this column with a mitochondrial scientist at Oxford called Joanna Poulton, from whom I got the information, and she's quite a leading researcher, so I'm taking her word for it. I had several concerns, and I think they really failed to come out in the coverage in the UK. For example, The Guardian, which is, our most progressive newspaper, had 3 major mistakes in the first 2 paragraphs of its coverage, and they were as follows. First, it said that only a sliver of DNA from a donor was required. What's required is an egg. Okay, so we're back to all the questions about how you get eggs to be enucleated. And, the technique is somewhat similar to the Dolly technique, or rather the techniques that derived from Dolly, the somatic cell nuclear transfer techniques in stem cell research. And for several years, we've had a lot of controversy and in some cases legislation against that use of eggs. the fact that they were even required hardly came out in the UK consultation, or as I say, in the newspapers. The second thing was the idea of whether this was going to cure disease. And again, The Guardian, in its first 2 paragraphs, said, yeah, this is going to cure diseases. No, it's possibly, the technique is not actually that well validated at present, possibly going to prevent mitochondrial disease in the next generation, or at least extreme mitochondrial disease. But as Joanna Poulton told me, it would only be in extreme cases. And then finally, the question is whether you should have whether you should cross the barrier into changing the genome of the next generation. That transgenerational research has actually been banned in most countries, but the presentation in the UK newspapers was the UK will be first. Yeah, you can be the first to break the international consensus, and is that good? So those were my concerns, and I didn't feel that they were adequately represented in the UK debate.
Okay. So we have another question. It states that you hinted that even me medicine isn't truly about the individual, but is about the individual as a composite of group identities. So can you elaborate on how the niches that pharmaceutical companies are investing rest in part on racial or ethnic classifications and or any other group categories that are assigned to individuals in medical treatment?
Yeah, I do actually have a case study in the chapter on pharmacogenetics on Bidle.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously I don't donate as much time to it as some of the other books, Jonathan Cairns or Dorothy Roberts. But I do use their books to raise this question of whether pharmacogenetic prescribing could also include racial prescribing. There's 2 reasons to think it won't, and that is that race is not a scientifically valid category, and that Bidle, as a drug, was not developed, despite the fact that the manufacturer claimed it was not developed with African Americans in mind. It was then targeted for African Americans later, but it wasn't actually originally developed with them in mind. So that's just a partial answer to your question about the racial element. As far as the stratified element goes, a lot of researchers in the field now prefer the term stratified medicine. And there's quite a good reason for that, in that it's sort of allowing you to pull back from the favorable connotations of personalized and be more reasonable about it. Because in general, what you are looking at is a statistical tendency of a particular, patient group. For example, if you get a retail genetics reading, it will not really tell you what your personal profile is in complete detail. Instead, it will give you a statistical comparison of your propensity to particular common diseases compared to other people. So it's, in that sense, the divide between me and we is not absolute, because it's looking at groups of people. And stratified medicine, again, is, for example, in oncology drugs, looking at groups of people who are likely to respond favorably or unfavorably to particular drugs. The one that was in the news quite recently was a drug for melanoma. There was an NEJM, a National New England Journal of Medicine article, which showed that 1 out of 4 people shared a particular melanoma sufferers shared a particular genetic profile. So that's stratified by that group, and this drug worked for them, which is fine. It didn't work for the other 3 and 4, but it did work for that 1 and 4.
Okay. The next question states, I was wondering if you could tell us more about umbilical cord blood banking, and if popularizing of biobanking, including cord blood banking, might encourage the public to have a positive perception on regenerative medicine, stem cell therapies, etc.
Yeah. So I'm not denying at all that the literature around cord blood banking, which goes back to the 1980s, has produced some cures. And I think that's really quite important. So in that sense, yes, it's part of regenerative medicine. And, there's quite a good evidence base out there. But the evidence base is in favor of allogeneic cord blood, that is from another person, another baby, not autologous. Now, this is really counterintuitive. And the first time I heard it was one of my graduate students told me, and I said, no, I think you better go back, that can't be right. But she was right. The evidence base definitely shows that the graft versus host effect means that the blood from another child is more effective than the child's own personal banked blood. And in some cases, the child's own personal banked blood could be harmful. Let's say that there's a genetic basis for leukemia, right? The last thing you want in that case is your own blood. So there is also a system of public cord blood banking. Now, the US actually has large numbers of cord blood banks that are public, and it's quite surprising again. But, they actually lead in that. The UK has 5, 6 if you count the Anthony Nolan Trust, which is a charity trust. And those banks allow you to retain a portion of the child's blood for your own use, and they donate the rest to a public bank so that it can be blended for allogeneic use. And the other advantage of that, the UK blood banks tend to be in areas with high multi-ethnic representation, so that it might well be that they're targeting a wider range, also socioeconomically, of people who can then benefit from the blood. So I'm very much in favor of it, and I think it does improve, the image in terms of regenerative medicine, and is generally a good thing when it's public. The only doubt I have is that there's now a global trade by the public banks in order to finance themselves in cord blood units, which means that they're sort of entering into the commodification routine as well. It also makes it less likely that your child's blood will still be there if you did want it for yourself, despite the caveats about wanting it for yourself.
Okay. Another question. Can you discuss how genetic tests can blur the difference between we medicine and me medicine and the issues that might arise with familial risk?
Okay, that's from Diane, isn't it? I'm not quite sure, not entirely sure what you mean, Diane. Can you just repeat the question, please?
So, can you discuss how genetic tests can blur the difference between we medicine and me medicine and the issues that arise with familial risk?
Oh, okay, I think I see now. Yes. Okay, because it's a little bit like the taking the family history idea that I mentioned before, as still seen as the gold standard in many cases. If you're having a genetic test like the BRCA1 or BRCA2 test taken as, for breast cancer propensity, or that is for the particular form of the particular allele or particular form of the gene that predisposes towards that risk, then in one sense you are looking at your own DNA makeup. In another sense, you probably were alerted to the need for that test because your mother or your aunt or your sister developed breast cancer at an early age. So in that sense, you might be doing it for we-related motives, but you would be getting information about me. I'm not 100% sure that I have answered that question, but I can see that genetics tests in themselves are not necessarily me medicine at all. Mm-hmm. But I think the use of the retail tests is very much predicated on the idea of looking after yourself. That's the positive side, being a responsible person looking after your own health. And also on the information about you. And very often the companies do say, 100 things about you and so forth. They sort of, stress that interest in your own personal DNA. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Okay, another question states that the frontier or difference between enhancement and therapy is very thin and often not explained to patients. Do you think this is a voluntary position of mainstream bioethicists?
Right, yeah. Yeah, I think the difference between enhancement and therapy is quite blurred, and some of the techniques that are being used in enhancement were originally used for therapeutic purposes. For example, I was at a consultation meeting of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, which is the UK national, well, it's not a governmental council, but it is a national council on bioethics, on the new neurotechnologies, novel neurotechnologies. Now, many of those, including various forms of implants, were originally developed to deal, for example, with tremors and other genuine physiological problems which have a neurological component. But there is now the idea of their being used more widely, or similar techniques being developed from those technologies, which would be used for so-called recreational purposes. The enhancement people don't really like the term recreational, so maybe I shouldn't use that. But that, and again, if you look, for example, at Ritalin or other drugs, originally directed at ADHD children, then children with an attention deficit disorder, that they would actually be useful more widely. They might be useful to calm down your 2-year-old if he or she was having a temper tantrum. Not sure we really want to go there, but that is the idea, that medicines that are originally developed therapeutically would have a sort of crossover, possibly. And I just go back to your question about the voluntary position of the mainstream bioethicists. I do think that the mainstream bioethicists, maybe particularly in the UK, have been very pro-enhancement, rather uncritically pro-enhancement in many cases, I think, and that they have not really, as you say, I would agree, they have not stressed that distinction. But I think there is also a problem in that they haven't always looked at the evidence, as I was saying about the conference in Oxford, and how they all said, oh yeah, it's here, the evidence is definitely here, when it's not.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have a few minutes left, and before we sign off, I wanted to give you a few minutes to talk about what's is kind of the main contribution of your book. And you talk about, you argue for a new type of biotechnology, one for the common good, or one that reclaims the commons. So I want to give you an opportunity to talk about what you mean by this and explaining your vision for how you think these new technologies can serve the public.
Thank you. Yeah, I would like to do that. Okay, I think it's really interesting that when we started out with the Human Genome Project, and when we had things like the Bermuda Declaration and various other conventions that defined the human genome as the property of humanity, the common property of humanity, we were looking at a we medicine approach to genomics. And yet suddenly, here we are with all the personalized genetic tests and everything, we're looking at the me medicine approach. Has it degenerated, or, why? Yeah, how have we moved in that direction? And I think that is I personally think that's a really important question to ask. And it's one that I am particularly interested in because of my long-standing interest in property and property in the body. So Body Shopping is about that. The book that I brought out with Cambridge, Property in the Body, is about that. And my earlier book, Property, Women in Politics, is about that. And in those cases, I have asked about, the commons and whether we can have property in common as well as individual. Now, I think if we go back to the notion of property, it's actually very productive, because what we have in our common law, Anglo-American notion of property, is a differentiated notion of property, what's often called a bundle of rights. So let's say I have a property in my vote. You and I both have a property in our votes. We can cast our votes as we please. We have that right. We don't have the right to sell our votes. So our property can be differentiated. And what I would like to see is a use of that notion, plus the use of the old Anglo-American notion of the commons, to apply more widely to the genome and more widely to bioethics. And we are seeing a lot of moves in that direction. For example, David Winnicott here in Berkeley has developed this notion of the charitable trust in bioethics. And that's important because if we look at some of the business plans, for example, 23andMe has an arm called 23andWe, which is about setting a, part of the aim is to encourage customers of 23andMe to send in more epidemiological and family data about themselves. And what that then does is produces a biobank. Now, biobanks are great, very important for research, also extremely valuable. And you then have to ask, well, should those biobanks be public? In the NHS, we do have, in the UK, we have the public UK Biobank, which after a certain amount of pressure from activists, is now in a position where it can't sell on those samples. For example, if it should go bankrupt or something like that, it can't be asset stripped for those valuable biobank samples. That is a kind of commons. And it's kind of like the old agricultural commons that everybody contributed to. They contributed their labor, and then they could reap from it. They could enjoy, the rights to pasture their animals or, gather reeds or something like that from it. Now, I think that Winnicott's idea is a great idea about enhancing the commons in modern biomedicine. And that is an idea, I just would like to stress that the book isn't just about the science, although, it is substantially about the science. I am a political philosopher by training and a lawyer, and I'm interested in the philosophical aspect of the commons, but also in the practical aspect, because it's really important how we decide to move forward with this vast wealth that is being produced in biobanks. And I would like to